Okay, last but not least, here is the last video for Chapter 7. So the Miranda Rule. If you've watched any TV ever in your life, I'm sure you've heard the Miranda warnings. It came out of a case called Miranda versus Arizona, which was, it's highlighted in your book on page 155, has to do with a man named Ernesto Miranda. In 1963, was arrested at his home for kidnapping and rape of an 18-year-old woman. He was taken to a Phoenix police station and questioned by two officers. 2 hours later, the officers emerged from the room with a written confession signed by him. A paragraph at the top stated the confession had been made voluntarily, without threats or promises of immunity, and with full knowledge of my legal rights, understanding any statement I make may be used against me. He was never advised he had a right to remain silent and a right to have a lawyer present. The confession was admitted into evidence at his trial, and he was convicted and sentenced to prison for 20 to 30 years. He appealed, claiming he'd not been informed of his constitutional rights. The Supreme Court of Arizona held that his constitutional rights had not been violated, and they affirmed his conviction. The Miranda case was subsequently reviewed by the United States Supreme Court. So it's actually a really interesting case if you'd like to read it. It starts on page 155 and it finishes on page 156. And I don't think I assigned it. I may have, but you'll have to wait till the end, I guess, to find out whether I did. There are some exceptions to the Miranda rule. So one example or one exception is, for example, when you go to the airport and you go through TSA and they search you, that they don't have to tell you that anything that they find on you could be used against you in a court of law, because it is in the best interests of public safety that they check you. Let's see, I don't think a defendant's statements that reveal the location of a weapon would be admissible under this exception is another one. Also, you might, the other requirement of the Miranda rule is that you must unequivocally and assertively ask for a lawyer. So you can't just say, hey, do you think I need a lawyer? You need to say, I want to stop, I need a lawyer. And you have to just be really assertive about that. So if you ever, God forbid, find yourself in that statement, in that type of a situation, just saying maybe I should see a lawyer, or do you think I should see a lawyer, or being kind of ambiguous about it is not going to cut it. You have to be very assertive and definite about it. The criminal process is really long. There's a snapshot of what it looks like on this slide. There's a ton more information. The major procedural steps are in Exhibit 3 on page 157. Or Exhibit 7.3, I'm sorry. The other thing that I think is important, I think we mentioned this 1 or 2 times, we talked about it maybe in class, but a grand jury, yeah, we did talk about it, I think, when we were talking about A Few Good Men. Grand juries don't determine guilt or innocence. All they do is establish whether or not there is enough evidence to proceed with charging that person and being successful at trial. A grand jury, this is out of your book, determines if there's probable cause to believe that the defendant committed the crime. The federal government and about half the states require grand jury indictments for at least some felonies. So read through those. That's kind of an interesting layout. Federal sentencing guidelines. There's a lot of information here, but the guidelines, there used to be some guidelines that existed, and this is just kind of like the layman's terms to this guidelines thing, but basically the snapshot gets down to this third bullet where it says the guidelines became advisory instead of mandatory. So they had some advisory punishments that existed, but they were required. So if you committed X crime, this was your sentence. If you committed XY crime, this was your sentence. After a 2005 Supreme Court case was heard requiring these to be converted to advisory instead. There's a case in point on page 158. Freddie Booker was arrested with 92.5 grams of crack cocaine in his possession. He admitted to police that he had sold an additional 566 grams of crack cocaine, but he was never charged with or tried for possession of this additional quantity. Nevertheless, under the federal sentencing guidelines, the judge was required to sentence Booker to 22 years in prison. The court ruled that this sentence was unconstitutional because a jury did not find beyond a reasonable doubt that he had ever possessed the additional 566 grams of crack. So, interesting. This is what the federal sentencing table looks like. This, I don't think, ever gets modified, but they will tell you what offense level you are, and then what number, what zones you're in, however many times, how many counts of each of these. So if you had 43 counts of a level 1, you're going to spend your life in prison. And those are advisory, like I said. So a judge can look at that and say, hey, you know what, this person has this extenuating circumstance, or this was, I don't know. They can look at it and modify that outside of the realm of those suggestions. There are some factors that increase what those penalties might be. Penalties can be enhanced for white-collar crimes, violation of Sarbanes-Oxley, and violation of securities laws. The sentencing judge must take into account the various factors that apply to the individual defendant before concluding that a particular sentence is reasonable. When a defendant is a business, these factors include the company's history of the past violations, management's cooperation with investigators, and the extent to which the firm has undertaken specific programs and procedures to prevent criminal activity. So if you're in trouble for violating the law as a business, and you cannot prove that you've done anything to train your employees, you're in a mess. So this is another reason it's really good to make sure that you're not only training your employees, but documenting that you're training your employees. Cybercrime is just when you use a computer. This is the Department of Justice definition of cybercrime as any violation of criminal law that involves knowledge of computer technology for its perpetration, investigation, or prosecution. So it's a big category. So most are just existing crimes that we've already talked about or that you've already heard about, but just using a computer to perpetrate the crime. Richard O'Dwyer ran TVShack.net, a website with links directing users to copyrighted TV shows and movies. U.S. authorities seized his .net domain name, claiming that the site was nothing more than a search engine for pirated content. O'Dwyer simply moved the site to a .cc domain, over which the United States has no authority. There you go. A little loophole. Cyber fraud and cyber theft. Cyber fraud is just fraud that's committed using the internet or a computer. There's online auction fraud. We've talked about some of that where you don't actually have the item, but you pretend that you do and get people to buy the item and maybe wire you the money, and then they never get anything. Your book has some more examples of that, but a person puts up an expensive item for auction on either a legitimate or a fake auction site and then refuses to send the product. Or the wrongdoer may send the purchaser an item that's worthless or a knockoff or something like that. So they actually get something, it's just not what they ordered or paid for. Online retail fraud is where customers or consumers pay directly without bidding for items that are never delivered. So some of you may have had experience, I'm sorry to say, with this, where you buy something from some vendor, typically not on Amazon, but you buy something from a vendor and you never get anything, or you get something that's not the same as what you bought. The case in point about that, Jeremy Janes grossed more than $750,000 a week selling non-existent or worthless products such as penny stock pickers and internet history erasers. By the time he was arrested, he had amassed an estimated $24 million from his various fraudulent schemes. $750,000 a week. That's not small change. Cyber theft is another. Identity theft and phishing are examples of that. Phishing, the example that they give here in your book, is consumers of Wachovia Bank received official-looking emails telling them to type in personal information on a web form to complete a mandatory installation of new internet security certificate, but the website was bogus, so they filled out the forms and gave their information to a fraud. Employment fraud, where you post this occurs when you post your resume and contact information out on the web that you're looking for a job, and people use you to get information. They may say, hey, we need some information for a credit check or whatever, and they actually have no job to offer you. They just want your information. Credit card information or credit card numbers. It's really important to understand the risks you take by storing credit card numbers of your customers. So you might pay special attention to that. Hacking. I think you're pretty familiar with what hacking is. I'm just going to try to move along. Malware. You guys are probably familiar with that too. Botnets are a form of malware, so it's any program that's harmful to a computer or its user. Worms reproduce themselves as they spread through the different computers to the next. And viruses reproduce themselves but have to be attached to a host. So a virus is where you get an email that's, my grandpa got one that said, hey, Eddie, let's be friends. He clicks on the attachment, it puts a virus on his computer, and then he has now become infected. Service-based hacking, some of you may have seen this, but if you download software, sometimes companies offer software as a service, and I'm thinking like Zoom is one of those examples. But instead of buying the software and installing it, so instead of getting a disk in the mail like you used to, you just connect to a web service to perform that work. So hackers, in this case, just rent the online services of those cyber criminals for small fees. So that's one. Cyber terrorism, the goal of it is just theft of data, because data is power and data is money. They monitor a computer to discover business plans or transactions. They can also insert fake codes or data to mess things up. So, for instance, the processing control system of a food manufacturer could be changed to alter the levels of ingredients so that consumers would become ill. Oh, that's scary. Prosecution of cybercrime, there's some information that exists there, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. There's also some issues with jurisdiction, as you might imagine, because where is the cyberspace located? Well, is it where it's hosted? Is it where there's lots of issues that exist there. That is it. Please email me if there's any questions you might have, if there are any questions you might have, or if you just have a desire to talk, or if you're wanting to get clarification on life plans or whatever. I miss you all dreadfully.